Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This event is brought to you by the Motivation SIG at IAPL, the International Association for the Psychology of Language Learning. It is also brought to you by Saudi Soul. Today, my guest is Dr. Robert Murphy. Dr. Murphy is an associate professor at the University of.
Kitakyushu.
Can you help me?
Yes,
Can you
yes.
help me again?
Kitakyushu.
Okay, yeah, that one. Specializing in Neuro ELT and Applied Linguistics. His PhD was supervised by Dr. Professor Zoltan Dornyei at the University of Nottingham. Regarding neuroscience and education, Robert was mentored by Professor Kurt Fisher at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He later co-founded the FAB Neuro-ELT conferences and has authored several textbooks based on neuroscientific principles. Throughout his career, Robert has focused on the development of innovative teaching methods that integrate cognitive science into motivational language education. He also enjoys teacher training. Welcome, Dr. Robert. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
So, to
Wonderful to
start
be here.
off, tell us something about your background and your time at Harvard.
Well, my background here is Japan.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm half Japanese, by the way. I'm American Japanese. Um, you mentioned Harvard. Yeah. So I was always interested in science from a young boy, when I was a young boy. And I got into language teaching. Um, because I had great teachers in the past and I wanted to become a teacher myself. But when I was studying for the TESOL, like my master's degree and stuff, I kept looking for the page in the book that said, and here is the proof that this method works best from neuroscience. And this is this is the evidence we have to show that, yeah, this is the best way to teach. And Ali, you know very well, no such page exists.
Yeah.
Right? Especially 15 years ago, or however long ago that was. And so I was looking around. How can I get a more scientific understanding of how education works, how the brain learns? And then I found out about this program at Harvard, who was started by Professor Kurt Fisher there at the Graduate School of Education. It's called Mind, Brain, and Education. They have master's program. They have online, certificate programs. And the first step for me was to do a summer institute. So I went to campus for a week, and then I studied with really the top professors in the Harvard Graduate School of Education. They were going bam, 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 bam. Every hour we just got another great teacher there. And it was all constructed, though, by the Dr. Kurt Fisher. He wanted easy access to this content for teachers who were just willing to come to campus and listen to what they had to say. And it really, really affected me on a very strong level. And I got very close with Dr. Fisher, that I started taking other courses with him, and then he became my mentor throughout my master's degree, even though I was taking a master's degree at the University of Birmingham in the UK, unrelated to Harvard. And then when I started my PhD with Dr. Zoltan Dornyei, on the side, Dr. Fisher from Harvard was always mentoring me as well. So I was very, very lucky to have his mentorship and guidance on the side, explaining to me how neuroscience looks at these issues, and how I can shape my understanding from a neuroscientific perspective, whilst also taking care of my duties as somebody researching in applied linguistics. And they're not always automatically compatible. And so there was a big shuffle for me. But I was lucky to have these two great mentors, actually, Dornier and Fisher, both of them. It was an amazing time for me. So that's kind of my
So
background. Yeah.
yeah, did you spend did you were you physically present at Harvard University?
Oh yeah. I went every year. So that first week was it was called the Summer Institute, and so we stayed at Harvard, and then we were studying in the Harvard classrooms for that whole week, and then after that there were some online classes. I think there were 4 or 5 online classes that I took, and then when Dr. Kurt Fisher decided, well, he agreed to actually take me on to mentor me. I would visit campus and I would stay for like a week, and then he would book office hours with me. And then so I would be, it's like your PhD supervisor, although he's not getting paid for this at all. I mean, I wasn't even, enrolled in any courses and majority of this time at that point. But every year I would go and, he would look at my work and answer all my questions for that whole week that I was there. And so that went on for several years. Unfortunately, he passed away during COVID, due to COVID-related diseases, as Dr. Zoltan Dornyei as well. So I lost both of my mentors during this COVID period. So yeah, that came to a sad ending. But yeah, that's the background.
So I'm digressing now. So
Hmm.
you studied in the US
Hmm.
at one of the top universities, and you studied at Nottingham in the UK, also one of the top universities. How was the experience different?
Oh, wow. Well, the listeners here may not know this, but Ali and I are colleagues. We both studied under Dornier, and we met on campus several times, and we would talk. And whenever we'd meet, we'd talk for hours. We'd sit in a corner somewhere and just talk for hours about stuff. Um, Harvard is like that too. But at Nottingham, it's not like you could just sit down anywhere and get really, I mean, at Nottingham, how should I explain? Nottingham had all the students there all at once, like say the Portland building or wherever, we had the younger students and the older students, and it's not like it was really segregated too much. But at Harvard, I was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and so the people that I was around were just really focused on talking about education and developments in education and really inspiring each other with these conversations. And it was hardly ever about, oh, where's the next party or something like that. I mean, so um, the experience was, I think, more tiring at Harvard because it was just so intense. But that's a good thing, right? My brain was always hot, right? At Nottingham, it was a bit more relaxed. But of course, as we know, Dr. Zoltan Dornyei can be an intense supervisor. So we had moments of intensity, of course, with the office hours. But yeah, there's quite a big difference. And the other thing is, I must Nottingham's campus is probably the most beautiful campus I've ever set foot on, right? And just amazingly
Yeah.
beautiful. Harvard Graduate School of Education, they have probably one of the ugliest buildings I've ever seen. So I mean, that's a funny thing to compare, but yeah, that there was a huge difference in beauty, aesthetics.
Okay, interesting. So let's jump into today's topic. You said that the program was mind, brain, and education.
That's right. That's right.
Could you please, give us some of the technical terms that we need to be aware of before we get deeper into this topic?
Yeah, yeah. So Dr. Kurt Fisher, well, I'll just abbreviate. So, Kurt Fisher, or Kurt, um, he came up with this idea of mind, brain, and education specifically because he noticed that the education department and the psychology department and the neuroscience departments, they didn't talk to each other. And the jargon was being developed separately. And it was very confusing to try to make sense of papers written in neuroscience and how to extrapolate something from that for the sake of educators, or what is psychology doing, and why aren't educators more in tune with what's happening in psychology? And the situation has vastly improved. We're talking like 20 years ago now. But so he came up with the concept. Well, we have to have a joint program where these three groups work together. Mind, brain, and education. So mind meaning psychology, mind, brain. Brain, of course, is brain, and education is education. So
brain here in this context means neuroscience,
neuroscience,
but
sorry, yeah,
mind
meaning
means
neuroscience.
psychology.
Yeah, psychology, neuroscience, and education as a field.
Applying all these into education.
Into a single unit. Yeah. So the three inform each other. The three should be informing each other, right? Now, but basically, yeah, most of the people who are studying this are educators. Yeah. So the underlying principle, yeah, basically it's for educators or teacher trainers and stuff like that. Now, the funny story that Kurt told me, this was on day one. When he came up with the concept, they had to have a meeting. We're going to create a new department. This is a big deal. Now, the committee members, these are full professors at Harvard. The committee members, they're sitting, in their seats and listening to Kurt talk about his proposal, which sounds wonderful, right? A number of them said, "What does the brain have to do with education?"
How many years ago was this? Maybe
20 years ago, about 25 years ago. Okay. And it's really funny to hear that. Now, I can kind of understand where they're coming from, because the papers until then, this is exactly why he wanted to create this program, but papers back then didn't mesh the brain with education. So, it sounds like a funny question, but it was also a serious question. What does the brain have to do with education? We weren't able to see papers like that back then. So yeah, it was a legitimate question, but still very awkward question at the same time. Laughable now. And because Kurt was able to push it through and actually start this up. So at Harvard, it's called Mind, Brain, and Education. Many other institutions, because it's a cumbersome, long word, three words. Some of them call like neuroeducation, and there are a number of other words that other institutions use, but they're pretty much the same thing. They're trying to mix understanding of how the brain works with education and informing each other about that. And another interesting example is I go to many neuroscience conferences. And a lot of those neuroscientists are really, really terrible at presentations. I mean, so I can tell that they're probably really lousy teachers. See, they don't know about education. They're only trying to convey what they did and what they, and so they're not very interesting in front of the mic. So yeah. This mind, brain, and education, so it should be informing each other. So the neuroscientists should also be able to learn how to become more effective communicators and more effective teachers.
Okay, so perhaps as a result of this integration attempt, we have dynamic skill theory.
Oh, yeah.
Which seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, is the brainchild of Kurt Fischer.
That's right. So let me get a slide out here. Can you see today's title? Yeah.
Yes.
Dynamic skill theory is Dr. Kurt Fischer's work completely. He is called a neo-Piagetian or neo-Piagetian. So he studied, anybody who studied psychology, have learned Piaget's work from France, right? The stages of development. This is like Psych 101. But there are a lot of things that were confusing about Piaget's work. So like if a student is able to reach this level at the age of 12, and they showed, proof of that today, why 2 or 3 days later is it that they went down? Why, indeed, it's a good question. And it was very difficult to give a good response to that adequately, But what Kurt did, he came up with dynamic skill theory, which the genius of it is that it explains why we do better on some days and worse on other days, while also mapping out how we develop naturally across the years. And by the way, University of Kitakyushu. This Kitakyushu. Yeah, I'm in Japan. One of the four major islands in Japan is Kyushu, and Kitakyushu means northern Kyushu. Yeah. Okay. So this question, so dynamic skill theory. So what I have to do now is talk about dynamic skill theory. It's going to take a few minutes to talk about. This is not something that I can just explain in 30 seconds and everybody will catch on. In fact, some courses spend weeks and months just to find out what dynamic skill theory is all about. So I'm just trying to give you a gist of that, and enough for it to make sense for the other conclusions that might be coming up later in today's talk. Especially in light of motivation, right? We talked about this already. So I was mentored by Kurt Fischer at Harvard, and also Zoltan Dornyei at Nottingham, right? And one of those, Ali asked the question, and I didn't answer this about the jargon, some interesting jargon difference, and I'd like to point this one out before I go a little bit further. This was something I probably learned maybe day one or day two from Kurt, is the difference between learning and understanding. Now, in layman's terms, learning and understanding are both, the same thing, right? Pretty much. Now, you teach something, and then you have a test, and then the results are the evidence of the test. And say this is like an algebra class, right? This is very standard, right? There's nothing so special about that. Now, how about this algebra class, though? Instead of having that test, you do the teaching, but the test is quite different, because the evidence this time isn't something that was written out, but it's going out in the real world and say, so because this is algebra, say, okay, there's this cup of coffee with 300 milligrams or milliliters, and this one is, say, 450, and then you're being able to figure out which has the better cost performance there using algebra. Okay, so now that is evidence of using what you had learned in the real world. At Harvard Graduate School of Education, so they use the term understanding with a capital U to specify the type, the differentiation between learning and understanding. So here, the difference. Evidence of learning. You can take a test and you might get a 60% or 70% or 80%. So that's evidence that something has been learned, right? But how much of that is applicable to the real world? That's the question that is brought up at Harvard. And so the way to differentiate that is to use the term understanding with a capital U. And then so that now we can, if they're able to apply that content in the real world, then that is understanding with a capital U. I think this is very useful, and this was an eye-opener for me, because this works exactly the same way with language teaching. If you're a language teacher, then you can take a test, a vocabulary test, a grammar test, whatever, and you can get a really high score. But out in the real world, are you able to order the coffee you wanted, or use that vocabulary in a realistic way? If you can, if you show proof of that, and there's evidence, then we call that, yeah, you have demonstrated understanding with a capital U. And the working theory, the working, what should I say, terms behind this is called um, making understanding visible. Making understanding visible. Because here, it's not exactly visible. We don't know how much of that is actually applicable in the real world, where in this case, it's obvious, right? So, making the learning and making the understanding visible. That was a big eye opener for me. And that's the kind of jargon that's a little bit different from things I hear, the things I read about in, say, like TESOL papers, right? Okay. Now,
So,
the other
so
one, so
before we continue, let me
yeah,
jump in.
yeah,
So, distinguishing between learning and understanding
hmm
apparently has huge implications for assessment.
yes.
So can you talk about just briefly about assessment here? How we are traditionally assessing students, how we should be assessing students from this perspective?
It's just so amazingly different that most types of tests are because people don't frame it as with a capital U understanding, right? So everybody is looking at, well, how much can be like parroted back? How much can be reproduced on the paper? And then it's easy to collect that data, and it's easy to get statistics on the classroom data and all that. It's so streamlined and simple. However, we have absolutely, well, let's take Japan. And viewers here, if you're familiar with the education system especially with English in Japan, students here study a minimum of 10 years in English now. Elementary, junior high, high school, and then usually university as well. But most people cannot have a 2-3 minute conversation in English. Now, what kind of ridiculous, return on investment is that? You study for 10 years and you can't have a 2-3 minute conversation. And so, your question about assessment here, Japanese students are being tested and tested and tested with grammar and vocabulary for 10 years, and they get their scores. Some do well, some don't do well. But most of them, at the end of the 10 years, the proof in the real world shows us that it's not really going anywhere. So they haven't really understood it in the capital U Harvard meaning, right? And so if you know that, then suddenly the way you test the students changes. You have to, well, I'll get into this later, but for metacognitive purposes and such, it's really important to get the students in on this. Have the students understand the difference between learning and understanding. And junior high school students can understand it, definitely. This is not something that'll be over their heads. I talk with junior high school students about, so junior high school, and I primarily teach at university. At university level, of course, they can understand it if I explain it properly. And so when they're in on it, and then I say, well, look, we have this vocabulary, and then I want you to talk about this, and so I'd like you to create a video demonstrating your understanding of this topic. They know exactly what I mean at that point, right? And so I'm assessing them for understanding and not for how perfect the grammar is or how perfect, the vocabulary usage is. It's more of the bigger picture that I'm looking at. So it
So there
dramatically
is one
changes
question.
assessment.
Yeah, there is one question in the chat which is
Okay,
also important. Now,
okay.
before we can change assessment, we have to also change teaching method.
Yes.
So it doesn't make sense to change the assessment without also adapting our teaching methodology. So
Mhm.
tell us more about teaching in Japan and from your experience.
Well, my teaching has changed very much over the years because of this research that I've been doing in mind, brain, and education with especially with the mentorship of Kurt Fisher. So Actually, I will be talking about that later. So I guess we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. I have something planned. So we'll get it. We'll get to that question, definitely.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, okay. Let's move on now.
Yeah. So, my question was, so motivation here, that's the other one. From a applied linguistics perspective, and people who study motivation in that realm, we sort of have an idea of what motivation is. But do neuroscientists have a different meaning for motivation? Now, I'm going to keep that question lingering as I go on with the next slides, this will, I think, will make sense, and everybody will be able to come up with your own responses to this. So we're going to look at this question here. How does the brain learn? Okay, from the perspective of Kurt Fischer, the father of mind, brain, and education. So let's start looking here. And remember, we're also talking about motivation, how it connects to motivation. How does the brain learn and then understand? Because, of course, we're talking about learning and understanding, right? Learning comes first, and then the deeper, the ability to use it in the real world, that comes later. So let's look at a typical neuron. I'm sure you've studied this in biology. You've seen this before. This is a typical neuron. Information, the stimulation comes here, okay, into the dendrites. And here there's a nucleus. Basically, the nucleus, of course, I'm sure you remember, is like the brain of the neuron. Now, what does this nucleus do? There's a threshold. This information comes in, and the nucleus basically, its job is to decide, is this interesting information or not? Do I want to pass this information on or not? Okay? Now, how do you think the nucleus decides if this information is important or not? Some neurons are inclined to quickly respond to some sorts of stimuli and not to others, okay? So there's a natural tendency, natural biases already built into neurons. But more importantly, so you might think there's an intensity involved here. Wow, stronger impulses are coming in. So then the nucleus gets overwhelmed and says, it crosses the threshold and says, oh yeah, I got to tell all the other neurons about this. Of course, I thought so as myself, but that's not the case. It's not intensity, but it's the quantity. It's how many times this neuron gets tapped. It's like, hey, whoa, listen to me. I got information. And then finally, if it meets the threshold, the nucleus will go, okay, I guess this is important. And so then what does it do? It shoots action potential down here, and then neurotransmitters pop out at the end over here, okay? Now, to an adjacent neuron, okay? There might be other neurons over here, and the same thing goes over again. And then, so these neurotransmitters keep coming across, and finally this nucleus is going to have to say, oh yeah, okay, that's interesting information. Okay, go at it. So even at this level, we can say the neurons must be motivated to work, okay? There's a threshold that has to be met even in these neurons. Now, the plot thickens, okay? So it's not only about meeting that threshold. This is very interesting. So it says here, the Schwann cell. On the axon here, you notice these, it looks like pool noodles or something, right? Like noodles around this. What is this? This is insulation. Insulation. Okay, so an electrical impulse goes down here. Now this insulation is called myelin. And the more times this neuron is being used effectively, then it gets more and more insulated. Now, the more insulated the axon gets, the faster that transmission is. Okay? And so, when you have a number of networks competing, okay, trying to get to a solution, okay, the The ones that are more highly, the networks that are more highly myelinated reach the destination, reach the conclusion far faster than the neurons that are still trying to figure things out and don't have much insulation, okay? And so this myelination causes bias towards this response, okay? The faster responses are the biased responses. Now, this bias is actually proof of learning at a very rudimentary level, okay? The fact that we have a network that works very rapidly compared to other networks that don't go rapidly, right? So like you see a red light, that means stop, okay? You don't think about the red light every time. I hope you don't, right? We've learned that. We learned that a long time ago. We are biased towards, so when we see a red traffic light, then we know to stop. When it turns green, we know to go, right? Those networks are heavily myelinated. They go very quickly. So it doesn't take us a long time to process such things. New information, however, does take a long time. The networks have to figure things out, and they're not yet myelinated. And so there's a whole issue going on there, along with the fact that the nucleus has to be motivated, has to be tapped enough to meet the threshold to say, yes, this is important information. Okay, so I'm talking about this because, so we can literally talk about motivation even down to the neuronal level. If this neuron is not motivated to pass on the information, it effectively becomes a dam. It stops the information, okay? We often don't think about neurons as dams, but they can be dams because if they won't pass the information on if they're not motivated enough. Okay, and so again, so this is a typical neuron. And then, so how does a brain learn? One way to respond to that is by networking, right? It networks and they get myelinated, and so now we're biased towards certain answers, and that's why we say certain responses much more quickly, much more confidently than other responses. Some responses take much longer, right? Okay, now as a metaphor though, let's think about languages, and culture and languages as, in Japan, say this beautiful rice field over here. Japanese people living in Japan, their brain. So this is a Japanese person's brain as a metaphorically, right? The location is Japan. The rice is growing here. Everything is working correctly as it should. And so let's say this is an American person's brain over here speaking English, and say this is a wheat field. Again, this is of course a metaphor here. Now, a bilingual person will be able to have, you know, both this rice field as a metaphor and the wheat field as a metaphor in their brains, and there could be some overlap, but basically a skilled bilingual or multilingual person is able to separate them enough that they can sound native or pretty native in either language, okay, if their brains are developed at this level. Now, the other way of thinking about it though is, how long does it take to create this wheat field? Or how long does it take to create this rice field? You can't just spend a few weeks and a few days and expect to have this wonderful, gorgeous field. So it becomes obvious that there's a whole lot of like years and a lot of groundwork necessary to create this, what should I say? Working knowledge of the language. And in this case, as a metaphor, we have these beautiful fields in front of us. Now, having said that, now let's go back to proper neuroscience, okay? Keep that metaphor in mind though. How does the brain learn? Okay, so Kurt Fischer would say, so things start at the singular level. We have one idea pops up in the head, and then we can talk about that, okay? Yeah, okay, fine. No, we understand. How did the brain receive this information? Okay, how did that singular idea, or how did that reflex get there? Okay. Well, that's a very important question. And then, how does the brain even receive that information, that singular thing, that piece of information we were thinking about? Well, some of you may have heard about the RAS, the Reticular Activating System. This is the brain, okay? Your eyeballs would be here. You'd be facing this direction, okay? This is the back of your head, okay? The cerebellum is back here. Now, here's a brainstem. Now, and you probably have heard of the limbic system and the brainstem. Like even fish, amphibians, animals have, all animals have these kind of brain stems here. A very simplistic, one of the oldest parts of the brain, okay? Is the brainstem. Now, the reticular activating system is part of the limbic, uses the limbic system and this brainstem here, and it filters out most of the information that's coming up from the body. It's hard to put a number on this, but maybe 80, 90, 95% of the information that our body is receiving, our neurons are receiving, the RAS filters out. We don't get that information because it would be information overload. Okay, so it's doing us a favor, okay? Now, what does the RAS then filter in? What does it let through, okay? It makes us alert about physical needs. So maybe we're hungry, so, or danger. Of course, sex, we need to have a sex drive to keep the human population, right? And so these things are physical needs, very basic needs for us to exist, right? Of course, so obviously this is extremely important. So that sort of information comes up, okay? No problem. All right. B, executive decisions that you have made recently. So, that's usually something, the prefrontal cortex, right? The front of your brain is like the executive of the brain. And maybe you made some decisions. You said, oh yeah, I forgot to pick up the laundry at the dry cleaners yesterday. So your prefrontal cortex is saying, oh, today when I'm coming home from work, I have to remember to pick up the dry cleaning. Okay, so then you go to work or whatever. Say you're a teacher, you teach all day, you're driving home. Something you see, it's not maybe particularly related to dry cleaning. However, something about it just inspires you. Okay, oh yeah, that's right. And you have that moment of like, oh yeah, I have to go pick up the dry cleaning. Now, if you didn't have that kind of stimulation coming up here, then you might again forget that you had to go pick up the dry cleaning. Okay, so it's important for us to pick up on cues that are closely related and even remotely related if they're going to help us with these executive decisions that we had made, okay? And then C, novelty. Yeah, so let's go back. Imagine when we were, living in the jungle, whatever, and we were out hunting, okay? And then a snake comes by, and we'd never seen this snake before. Or a lion comes by, and we've never seen a lion before. And, if we just assume that the snake is not important and just keep walking, then that snake, might bite us and we might die, or that lion might come and, maul us and we might die again. And so over the years with Darwinian logic, we have picked up the ability to understand that novel things are important to notice. Okay, that is what kept us alive. That kept our forefathers alive, right? The people above us, they passed on their DNA to us because they picked up on the novelty. Okay, so these three things get through, and most of the other things do not get through. This is very important information for teachers, because if 80 to 95% of the stuff we are doing in the class is also not getting through, then there's a problem, right? We have to look at this and see, how can how can we make our teaching content something that the RAS looks at and says, "Hey, yeah, okay, yeah. Let's let's get this through. Let's let the rest of the brain handle this information. It seems important." Okay, that's important as teachers to realize. Okay. Now another thing. So how does the brain use this received information after the RAS, after it has been passed? Very interesting work done by Imordino Yang. She is also a student. She was a student of Dr. Kurt Fisher at Harvard. She now heads up her own department at the USC in California in this educational neuroscience sector. And her work, along with her mentors at USC, were the Damasios, Antonio Damasio, and her work and their work clearly shows us that emotion is what is driving learning. Okay, and to quote her, emotion is the rudder. Okay. And so, point for teachers, emphasize the critical role of emotions in the learning process. Engaging the limbic system through emotional content enhances bias toward memory retention and naturally students' motivation. Okay. Now, again, bias here is the scientific meaning of bias. In layman's terms, bias sounds like a very negative term. In neuroscience, or in science in general, it just means a tendency, right? When you see a red light, you tend to stop. You're biased to stop. You see green, you go. There's nothing negative about that. It's a very neutral term. That's just bias is another term for like how the brain has learned to act in a certain way, right? And so emotion, though, is what is guiding this. Okay, so we as teachers really have to embrace this idea. If the student cannot get emotional about the content at some level, then the information is not really going anywhere, and it's wasting everybody's time, pretty much. Now, finally, we can get to this part. Okay, so what is dynamic skill theory about? Yeah, it took a while to get here. Now we're finally here. This is now, I'm really a nerd about brain science and how the brain works. And this was a huge eye opener for me. So this is Kurt Fisher's work. And I said earlier that he studied Piaget, but he's the person who made more sense of Piaget. He was able to answer the questions that remained with Piaget's work, the criticisms that remained with Piaget's work. Now let's look here. You see this gradation here. Now this is skill level, okay? Any given skill set is fine. Now what these numbers mean don't matter so much right now. It's just 2, 3, 4, 5, just they're going up and up, okay? Higher is more complex. Okay, red is more complex. That's all we need to know now. On the side here, okay, the x-axis, ages. 8-year-old, 12-year-old, 16-year-old, 20, okay, up to 28. How they perform on certain tasks, okay? Now, what Kurt did, with many other researchers as well, found out that, and very similar to what Piaget had said, that when you're 12 years old, okay, almost everybody, it doesn't matter what country you're in, if you're 12 years old, if you're asked an out of the blue question, you respond at this RP3 level, okay? You don't respond at something way over here. It just doesn't happen, okay? When you're 16-year-old, yeah, okay, it gets higher and gets higher. So that makes sense, okay? But what this blue line is talking about here is a functional level, low support, out of the blue questions. And in most classrooms, when we ask a student, it's like a cold question, right? Or even a questionnaire. people asking you something and you give an answer, or like you're in an elevator with somebody and somebody just pops a question. You don't give the most detailed response possible. You probably give the shortest detail, just enough to get by, right? And so in our classrooms, many students, what they're doing every day is they're just responding on this blue line, okay? They're living on this blue line, or even lower, perhaps. They're doing just enough to get by. Now, however, there's this interesting red line above here that says optimal levels. What Kurt found out, and then this is what puzzled Piaget, was that if the context allowed for deeper thinking, I should say, if the context required deeper thinking, and it really engaged the students, then suddenly, say the 16-year-old who could normally only respond to around over here, suddenly, if they're totally engaged, they can respond to a much higher level. Okay. Now, what does that mean for us in the classroom? What does that mean in real terms? Okay, that kind of makes sense as data, right? So what I did was, because I was in Japan and Kurt told me that nobody had done this research in Japan, so I did this these interview questions and tested this out in Japan as well. And this is an example from my research, my master's research and also my doctoral research. My university students, they're 20 years old, right? Around this area, 19, 20, okay? I had them come into my classroom, into my office after teaching them. And then I would say to the group, okay, let's talk about our course. I don't structure it. I just say, we sit them down and, we have a coffee and it's a nice atmosphere. And invariably, I should say, the responses are on this blue line, okay? And what that means in real terms is that all the students would talk about was what we did. We did this in the classroom, and we did that, and after that we did this. It didn't get any deeper. Now, it's not that these students were not motivated. In fact, they were really good students. They were what most people would say, these are highly motivated students. But they didn't give me higher level responses. Although theoretically, they should be able to, at this age, they should be way up here, 2 stages higher. They should be able to respond 2 stages higher. However, they didn't. Okay. Now that brings about a whole bunch of questions. Why aren't they responding at that higher level when biologically they should be capable of doing that? Why are they only responding here? And then the next interesting thing is, after 20 minutes of doing some specialized activities, they did go up to this red line. And they started talking about what we did in the classroom instead of saying what we did. They talked about the hows and whys of the things that we did in the classroom. And that is 2 steps above just simplistic what we did, okay? In dynamic skill theory and even in the way Piaget measured it. So what did I do? What did we do in those 20 to 30 minutes that had them jump 2 levels up? Okay, these were the same students, right? Okay, so what is the secret sauce here? What's going on here, and how can we use this in the classroom to, make everybody do better in this way? Okay, so we don't have time to go into great detail, but what the gist of it is, we used graphic organizers during the interview, okay? And I would say, okay, so we did different activities, rate the activities, okay? The first activity was not so good. I really like this activity, but D was the best activity. So the group of students are working on these graphic organizers to figure out these little tasks about the class, okay? And then maybe another task would be, okay, so how do we get from point A to point X over here? Okay. And then the students would discuss that, again, using like a graphic organizer to make sense on a piece of paper. Okay. And then they're looking at it with each other. And then also elements in the classroom, I would say, okay, categorize the things that we had done. So this is a metaphor for that. So the red cards are over here, the blue cards are over here. This is a metaphor for like how they categorize the things that we had done in the classroom. Like maybe they were speaking activities, they were writing activities, or whatever. They would work these things out. Okay. After working on these for the 20 or 30 minutes, right? Then we would return. Okay. To the same question. But what happened was these graphic organizers, the fact that they were working on these, it dynamically changed how their brains churned on the topic. Okay? It dynamically changed. Okay? It's not like they had forgotten what they had done, but the engagement of the brain had totally changed. And now their brains are fired up and much more willing to discuss what was going on in the classroom. Now, why is that? It's an amazing reinforcement loop going on here. See, they're looking at, they're saying, "Oh, I didn't like task A, but task B was much better. C, I didn't like so much, and D was the best." Okay, so the small group, 3 or 4 students, are looking at that. They're talking about that. They're asking each other. They're making sure if if that really was the true or not. And maybe they'd maybe ask me a question, or I'd jump in there and say something. And what goes on the paper affects their brain, and what's going on in their brain then changes. Ask them to change on what's on the paper. So then they might be editing what they have on paper. Okay, so this is amazing reinforcement loop that simply does not happen just because the teacher wants it to. Okay. We have to go through these kind of steps to get their brains fired up. Okay. We can't expect the students, highly motivated students, I told you they were, right? However, I still had to go through these steps to get their brains fired up and respond at the higher level. And so here it is again. These highly motivated students were here. But every time I did this, it would start off the same way. It would only be, what did we do? Okay. And then we go through those graphic organizers. They get, their voices change. Their eyes are sparkling. They start talking about the hows and whys, and yeah. And of course, I recorded all this, and so the data is all there, and it clearly shows that they use much more sophisticated language to discuss the hows and whys of what was going on in the classroom. Okay, and so the question here is, how might this change the classic meaning of motivation? Okay, because we would normally, I told you these are, or classically, these are motivated students. Yeah, we would say that, but they were not able to respond until the context was changed and their brains were fired up. Okay. Now, I'd like to perhaps open the floor and get some questions and feedback. What kind of answers do you have for this? Does it change anything about the way you feel about motivation? Or you have something you'd like to talk about? Yeah, please. Yeah, let's open the floor, Ali, for this.
So let me ask you a question.
Okay.
How do you connect this to the idea of intrinsic motivation? Is it like the novelty of the task, or is it?
So intrinsic motivation, That's a very good question. But see, intrinsic motivation, the people who talked about intrinsic motivation did not know about dynamic skill theory, right? And so, if that's why it's an excellent question. If you know about dynamic skill theory, then you wouldn't be talking about intrinsic motivation in the way that it is being discussed in most papers, right? Because for me, my question here, how does it change the classical meaning of motivation? Exactly. Down here, there. I mean, we can say that both at 20 minutes before and 20 minutes after, they both had the same amount of intrinsic motivation, perhaps, but the results were totally different. So, a traditional way, how can we assess? How can we say that motivation has changed? Probably I mean, are we supposed to say that because they gave more complex answers, now they're more highly motivated? Is it okay to assume that? I mean, it's kind of a paradigm shift in how we might be able to think about what intrinsic motivation is, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to hear, what other people might have
Yeah.
to say if they,
Before we
yeah.
continue, just a quick housekeeping note. If you would like to get an attendance certificate, there is a link in the chat. Please fill it in as soon as possible because the link will be disabled after this event. So there is one question in the chat. Why are optimal levels so low at the age of 12?
Ah, great, 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 great. Okay, so wonderful question. Yeah, we have the squiggly line, right? Why is red so specifically going up and down? So these are averages across all the students across the world, children across the world, and it maps out like this beautifully. Um, and however, the blue line here is kind of flat, right? So what's the difference, right? Why do we have these peaks? Well, when Kurt Fisher began to map out the difference between the dynamics between a high support context and a low support context, and realized that there's a huge difference between the levels, the complexity of responses possible at each age, right? Completely dependent on the context. Neuroscientifically, he was having a hard time explaining. Great question. He was having a hard time explaining why we have this peak, like say, maybe perhaps a 9-year-old is over here, but why does it go down, seemingly go down? Okay. Two things I want to bring up. One is the simple answer is, even if it goes down, it's still always going to be higher than the blue line. Okay. So there is always, always, always room to bring the, just enough to get by response to a far more complex response. There's always room to go up. Okay. But why does it go down? Now, on a totally separate research done in Sweden, I think, they were testing brains out, testing how EEG works on the brain, okay? And in the alpha band, they found out that the brain had interesting construction sites that say one area of the brain is working on developing, and then another area of the brain is working on developing another area of the brain. So there was a circular pattern around the brain. Okay, I'm using my head as a kind of a demonstration here. So there was a circular pattern of development. And when one cycle of development completed, that fell exactly here when we had the spurt. Okay, Kurt found that, right? And then the new cycle begins. The new cycle begins, there's a drop. So it seems that whenever the brain starts a new cycle of like the construction sites and what we're talking about development is the brain is always learning new things and always creating networks. However, interestingly, it also spends time making stronger connections between networks on a, like, there's a construction manual sort of written in our DNA that we follow this cycle. Anyway, so the pattern repeats itself consistently, and so one cycle finishes and a new cycle begins. It goes down, and then as the further we progress on that cycle, and then we come to the end of the cycle, we hit a peak, and then it goes down again, and then we go through the cycle, and and then why does this stop at 28? So that's you had a great question, and so this is how it ties into the age of 28 as well. Those construction site cycles stop when we hit 28. Interesting, isn't it? And so this kind of squiggly line, it just kind of plateaus. We don't have that anymore. Okay, it just this stays up like this, and then the blue line is kind of dwindles as well. Okay. And so I hope that answered your question. And so when Kurt Fischer found this out with the EEG, he jumped on it and looked at the other data, and it clearly showed that yes, this was the case. It's all about the construction sites within the brain, just going around and around. And when one cycle completes, we have to go down. The energy is being spent somewhere else. But my first point, number one, was that even if it goes down, it's always above. It's always above the blue line. So there is always work for the teacher to do. There's always work for us to try to keep them in these high support contexts so that they can be more sufficiently challenged and provide more complex responses to us and also for themselves. Okay, are there any more questions in this area?
Let's move on, and before we join, and just one other housekeeping note: if you would like to join the Q&A session, the link to the Zoom room is in the chat now. You can enter, and then you can use the mic to ask questions later on. Yeah. Let's continue.
Okay. So you have another question for Ali?
Let's move on to the next.
Oh, okay. So yeah, we were talking about these optimal challenges. So how do we as teachers, this is what we want to know, right? How should we be optimally challenging our students? We don't want to be wasting their time. We don't want to be wasting our own time, right? That's really important. So now looking at the levels again, now what each one means is not that important, but just let's look at the numbers, okay? So AB1, so that's a singular idea in the brain, right? All right. Now, with Kurt's work, now when two ideas become connected together, it's called AB2. Logical, right? AB1 is a singular point, and AB2. So two ideas are coming together, like, right? Okay. Now, and it's called a mapping, okay? A mapping of ideas. Now, again, this was a big eye-opener for me. We often talk about how the brain is all about making connections, right? And we're learning is about making connections. So after the mapping, then we can say two things were mapped together, but say now we have two maps, and those two maps connect to other maps, and now we have a system of understanding about something. Okay. We cannot just jump into, like, I cannot lecture about something and expect everybody's brains to be mapping out everything the way I want it to. Okay, everybody's brains are going to be connecting in different ways and creating their systems in different ways, right? But so AB3 is called the system, and then above that, AB4 is even more complex. It's a system of systems. So this is you can see how crazy complicated it is. Now, this helps us understand why we have these two lines. Now, I showed you here how crazy complicated it is to get to like an AB4 level of response. You have to have too many things on your mind, and you have to be trying to make sense, juggling too many ideas. It's very, very, very tiring, right? But if the context requires it, yes, we can go up to the challenge. And that is representative of this red line. Now, obviously, even if you're a motivated student, though, yeah, the data has shown us that first, when we're given a question out of the blue, we can only respond here at this functional level. Okay. Now, how do we create? The question is, how do we create these optimal challenges for students? What we have to do is look at the age groups that we are teaching. Okay, so everybody, listening here, or you have a specific student in mind. Okay, you can show them this graph as I do. I like to teach my students about this. And so if you're age 16 or if you're age 20, 24, okay, your simplistic response would be at this level. But if we do these graphic organizers and we spend time talking about it and you get really engaged, your eyes start to sparkle and we're having a spark of joy with this content, then yes, and then suddenly we're realizing we're going much deeper. And then it's obvious, right, when we start talking about more deeper things. If we have this graph in front of us, and if the students have this graph in front of them, then they can work with you and try to get themselves engaged. Okay, so it's not always just an upward battle for the teacher if the students are in on this. Okay, and so this graph can help us take a look at how to help create these optimal challenges and what each specific level means. Now, this takes a long time to explain. I have papers on this. Of course, Kurt has papers on this as well. Please look up dynamic skill theory, or you can email me questions later. I can help you in understanding what these specific things mean. Today is just the gist about this. Okay. So, metacognitive strategies. I just said that I help my students by showing them this graph, right? And I use this graph with my students. I show them this, and we further this by using graphic organizers to self-assess and to peer assess. Okay? Do you think your response now was on the blue line, or do you think that response was more on the red line? Is this paragraph that you wrote, is that really the best you can do? Is that the most complex response you can provide for me? Now, of course, we can do this in the L1, the first, the native tongue. We can do this in the L2, right? It doesn't matter which language you're working on. There's always going to be that functional level, that low support, and then that high support, right? And then getting the students on board with self-assessment and also peer assessment, okay? It depends on the classroom. You can have the students secretly assess each other, or you can have them openly assess each other. It depends on the culture of the classroom, right? It might be very bad, or it might not work out well if you have open peer assessment. In my classes, though, in Japan, surprisingly, it does work out. So I have my students peer assess each other openly, and they give grades to each other. And then there's, if they're only on the blue line, they get a C, right? If they're above the blue line, approaching the red line, they get a B, or if they're on the red line, they get an A. That's how they assess each other with the paragraphs or whatever the task has to be. Okay, so yeah, it takes a while for them to grasp what this graph means, but once they get it, they use it to to help with this metacognition and to help them understand the learning process better.
It will also help us to understand better if you also explain what the word metacognitive and metacognition means in the first place.
Oh, you mean, oh, sorry, the group we're addressing now? Yeah, sorry. So
Yeah,
meta,
so the word metacognitive.
yeah. Metacognition is simplistically saying it's like thinking about thinking, understanding what your understanding is, understanding what you're thinking about. Students don't automatically do this. Students tend to, well, many students, not all students, many students tend to just do what the task asks for, and they don't think much more deeply about it, right? So this is exactly what we're talking about here, being on the blue line. But metacognitive, being metacognitive about it is being self-aware, being aware of where you are right now. Oh, I'm on the blue line right now. However, if I apply myself, if the context changes and I get fired up, I can respond on the red line. Aha! This kind of thinking is what we're calling metacognitive. And so these metacognitive strategies that we're talking about now is having students self-assess and peer assess, and then also as they're self-assessing and peer assessing, I'm watching them from the side, and then I get a much better understanding of their grasp. I'm watching their metacognitive skills grow, okay? And then I get to peer into their skill development in a way that normal, standardized testing would never show, right? So this is going back to Ali, one of Ali's first questions, is how assessment changes dramatically if you are aware of dynamic skill theory and apply it to the way you teach and apply it to the way you design your classrooms. So any questions or ideas coming up?
Yeah, there is one more question in the chat. Now, when you ask your students to come to your class, to your office, and you talked with them, was this discussion related to reviewing the course itself, what the course is about, or was it about finding value in what they were studying?
Okay. That's a really good question. It ended up having them talk about the value of what they had learning when it got to the red line, okay? But, when I started the session, it was very simplistic. I said, let's talk about the class. I didn't have any, I didn't specify any agenda to them. I just said, I want you guys to come in and talk about the class to me. I want to get feedback from you. And that was the extent of it. And so, yeah, but typically it ended up being like, wow, now I better understand why this was constructed this way and why we did that. And then, of course, they would also give me advice and saying, well, this task, we didn't like this task, so maybe next time you should try doing it this way. And it was very helpful for me as well. Okay. Yeah. And such things would, students never bring that up though, when it's a cold question at the very beginning. Yeah, they only come out after we go through that battery of questions and the graphic organizers.
Okay, great. So
Okay.
moving on to the next point now.
Yeah, we yeah, we've been discussing a lot, huh? So I'd like to go quickly about maturation rates in L2. This is a concept that I stumbled upon when I was working on my PhD with Zoltan Dornyei at Nottingham. I was trying to figure out, so I was mapping out what students were able to do in their L2, but then I wanted to compare to the L1 to put and make it a simple way to assess them, right? So let's read here. L2 maturity as an equation is made possible by tracking cognitive complexity scores as from Lectica. So this is a company that looks at student writing and churns out the complexity level. How complex is that writing using dynamic skill theory, actually. So it's specifically tuned with dynamic skill theory, and it's called lexical analysis. So I use lexical analysis to produce each student's L2 complexity scores. So that means their English essays. How complex was their English, okay, in their essays? The beginning of the semester, at the end of the semester. Then I was able to judge which classes did better, which course books were more effective in this way, by judging how quickly one group's complexity scores rose compared to another classes, right? Okay, so L2 maturity, L2M, can be presented as a percentage that's calculated by dividing, okay, the student's L2 score with the student's L1 score. Okay, now what that means is, so when a student is writing in Japanese, so this is with Japanese students, their best essay in Japanese would be this score. Okay, their best essay in English would be this score. Okay, and then by dividing the two, then we get the maturity level of their L2 as compared to the L1. Very simple, right? Very simple idea. Now the problem is lexical analysis only does the tests in English, so we don't have a Japanese. We don't have a way to test their Japanese. But since we have Kurt Fischer's graph, we know where the norm would be. So we can use this as a substitute denominator, okay? So their level of L1, what they should be able to do in L1, compared to their English essay, okay? That gives us a usable number as well, because we can always track what this is using dynamic skill theory. We always know what the norm is at every age, and so then we can always come up with this L2 maturity ratio, and then we get a score. And so finally, if you do the math with it, say, let's go here, the L2 norm. So the Japanese student was, say this 10.3 stands for 10th grade. 10th grade 0.3, okay, 10th grade of high school. And over here, but their response in English was of a 7th graders going on 8th grader at 7.5. So let's just say that's what it means. So obviously the Japanese student, this high school student, is responding as a high school student should be, but the high school student's English level complexity is below that, okay? So you divide them and you get a 0.72, and so that's the maturity rate. It's interesting, isn't it? This is very helpful. You can do this for all your students as long as you have a way to test the complexity of their English, a product that you can test, okay? So you can say they have reached 72% maturity in their L2 if it's 0.72. Now we can take this further and say, well, what if then their English becomes a 10 and they're both 10s? So then this becomes a 1. If it becomes a 1, then that means their L1 equals their L2. Their maturity levels are now equal, and that could be a goal for you. You want to have balanced bilinguals in the class, say. And then that's a very tall order, but this very simple calculation will help you get there. You'll be able to test them to see, and you'd have the sort of proof that's, yeah, at least in this writing sample that you have provided, your L1 and L2 are now equivalent in maturity. Now, it can go one step further, and then L2 could be a larger number. Maybe L2 is a 12 and L1 stays at 10. What happened there? Is it possible? Oh, of course it's possible. that means maybe that student moved to another country. They moved to England or Australia or America somewhere. And now their L2, their English level complexity, they're able to write in a more complex way than their Japanese. And so this is also an interesting test to see that, oh, wow, so their old mother tongue is now below, and then the new English is now superior in their minds, right? So this L2 maturation rate, I think, is very simple, but I think it's very useful. Now, the key, though, is to find a way to check for complexity in the language that's being produced. Now, I used Lectica, but I don't, have a direct association with them. You, I hear there are other software. There's a software out there that looks at language being produced and gives you a complexity score, right? It's so if there's a way to standardize that for you, then please try using that instead of Lectica here, and then it's fine. As long as it's a standard, you can use that with all your students. That'd be an interesting way to track how well your students are doing and how well your teaching is, or how well the textbook is, how well the curriculum is working with those students by looking at these maturation rates.
So now,
Okay.
perhaps with the availability of AI tools, do you think teachers can use these tools to analyze the electrical scores of their students?
Yes, I'm really hoping they can. And in fact, Lectica is working on making it automated. They have some sort of automated versions of it now. Definitely, this is something that should come out in the future. I think there's a big potential here, and I don't know anybody else who's talking about, using this specific, it's very simple mathematics here, but I don't know other people who are doing this, and I hope that AI will be able to do that for us in the future. Yeah,
So
very
Lectica,
promising.
doesn't it already do this automatically?
They
Or do you have to?
have, they were, um, it was a couple years ago, before GPT became popular. They already had a computerized system for this. And so I haven't talked to them recently. Perhaps now they're using, higher level AI, because the AI now is completely different from what we had a few years ago, right? So perhaps they're now meshing what they had earlier and with AI. I would have to ask them how far they've progressed on that.
Is this software free?
No, Lectica is actually expensive. They gave me a kind of discount for because I was a PhD student when I was doing this PhD work. But yeah, when I inquired after being a student and just doing it as a researcher at the University of Kitakyushu, then the numbers went up. So this is not free. However, there are things like doesn't Microsoft have something like this where it can examine? There are apps that examine complexity, right? I mean, we have stuff like Grammarly and this and that, and AI that checks for plagiarism and stuff, right? But and so many of those would be free, or we already have access to them through the subscriptions that we already have. But the challenge here is how how reliably will that computer be grading each of the students? And we don't know that. Um, Even though humans are fallible, right now, I'm still more inclined to trusting a good lexical analysis scorer's assessment than a computer's assessment at the moment. But I have high hopes that that will change. I just haven't seen it yet. Okay, does that answer your question?
Okay. Yeah, yeah. One more question. So, if you could give us an idea of this complexity score, what elements go into the analysis from the
Ah,
student's writing to
yeah.
come up with this score, conceptually, at least?
Actually, this is all laid out in my PhD, and it's really long and dry and boring. But, but they actually look at a lot of things. But I keep coming back to this graph. But or maybe I should go here. Okay, so a simplistic essay would be talking about two things and the connection between two things, right? So maybe there's a paragraph and it says, well, it's baseball. I like baseball. It's a sport. I like sports, and therefore I like baseball. And that's a really mundane essay. And but they are literally connecting sports with baseball, and that's it. Okay, and so this would get a lower score, right? And whatever graph you have, obviously this will. So let's just call this, because it's AB2. They get an AB2, and it's not even a 2.1 or 2.2. This is exactly a 2.0. Okay. If there are elements that are saying, oh, it looks like they're trying to bring something else in, but they actually didn't, then it becomes like a 2.2 or 2.3, like that. And so there are ways to add the decimals, but we won't get into that. But the next step up is level AB3. Now, this is a much better paragraph or essay. Now it's comparing four different elements, but not in a circular way, but it's going every which way. Okay, that's a very detailed analysis of, like, say, a movie. Maybe there's four characters and how the four characters interacted with each other, or it could be maybe these are three characters and the intent of the director. What was the director doing? How did the director handle this character and that, and so this is a completely different level than here, right? And so then this score would be like a 3.0 instead of a 2.0 earlier, right? And then again, there are ways to figure out how the decimals work in between. And then the one above that, the system of systems, wow. This is really crazy detailed, right? So, we have so much to unpack here. Actually, this is more like a thesis. This is not like a paragraph or an essay anymore. This is a thesis. And so if your student is able to produce something like this and it's coherent, then they get an AB4. And so this is how we can compare these things. Now, so say a Japanese student is able to create a thesis, a well thought out thesis in Japanese. Are they able to do that in English? The standard average student would not be able to do that. The average student, maybe this would be the maximum. And so we can compare then. It was 3/4, right? The ratio would be 3/4, right? And so the goal might be to raise their English level, writing level, up to here. So they have to learn how to write a thesis in English, if that's the case. And then they would receive an AB4. Anyway, so that's the simple gist of how lexical analysis works. And there are much more. There are other criteria in there, but just using this dynamic skill theory as an example, that's how it works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure that all this has some practical implications, right?
Hopefully, right? Right. Okay. So, yeah, let's look at some practical applications. We're getting near the end here. Okay. So, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, the graphic organizers. They were amazing, weren't they? This is uh, specifically what brought those students up 2 levels, right? In my office, they were using these. Now, making learning visible, engaging, and tactile for the students and the teachers. Okay, it's making the learning visible. This is so important. I talked about this in the very beginning of this session. if we don't work things out graphically like this, their learning is not visible to us and to them. Okay? It's only when it gets down on paper and then edited and re-edited that we can see where errors might be, and we can see where what areas could be improved. And this automatically gets the students engaged. Okay? If we didn't have the graphic organizers in front of them, it wouldn't. It just wouldn't work. I mean, it's really hard to fire them up. Okay. So let's see what I've written here. In most classrooms, learning is invisible. Right. Exactly. Students could be looking at you. You have no idea if they're listening to you or they're thinking about something else. Right. If there is a test, only a portion of the content will be assessed. There is no such type of test that assesses every single thing that was learned in the classroom, right? So instead of that, incorporate mind maps and other graphic organizers from the beginning, okay? So don't rely so much on standard tests. Try to use more of these graphic organizers. And you can immediately identify the misunderstandings and correct errors in real time, okay? So that's the best kind of teaching, isn't it, right? Not the delayed, scores, like you get a score from a test from 2 weeks ago. How is that going to help the student learn? But in real time, you can make the corrections. So they'll be visible to you in the paper in front of you, right? Now, as I said earlier, they're an amazing reinforcement loop. Okay, it goes around and around, and maybe I ask a question, and it gets even deeper, right? So graphic organizers is like one of the best things you can incorporate in the classroom, and they're easy to do. Okay, that's the first one. Second one, power of prediction. Okay. Incorporation of prediction activities stimulates curiosity and deeper processing. So we talked about how the brain and the RAS, remember, the reticular activating system, only lets in information. There were three things, right? So the biological things, and then there was the biological things, and then the executive decisions that you had made earlier. Now, if the student is not fully engaged, maybe they don't have an executive decision to listen to you. They're just sitting there, perhaps, right? And then the third one is novelty. But if you have the power prediction, is suddenly there's a game element. Then more information goes through the RAS and more of the brain gets engaged. One teacher trainer that I heard at Columbia University in New York several years ago, she was talking about this, and she had this wonderful technique that I would like to share with you today. What she would do is she would go in the classroom, and in the front of on the board, she would write a number here. Maybe she'd write the number 7. Or she'd write the number 43. Okay, she'd write a number. And then she'd go on and do her lecture, and she'd do her class. At the end of the class, she would ask the students, okay, everybody, this number here, what did that mean? What was the purpose of this number? Okay. And some students would answer, some students would be puzzled, and some students probably had forgotten that she had given them that task or had written the number there. Now, so the first week doesn't really matter. The second week, she comes in and she writes the number again, different number. And then she goes ahead with the class. And at the end, she asks, okay, so what do you think that number meant? Far more students were now giving all these answers. Well, 7 are you pointed out 7 different points in this area, or some other student would say, no, it was about this, it was about that. And she says that it's really engaging. But the funny thing about this is her numbers were totally random. She confided in us. she just wrote a total random number. Now, this is not deception. This is not deception because in the students' minds, now she's a mind, brain, and education professor, by the way. She's a teacher in this area, teacher trainer in this area. In the students' minds, they're trying to make logic, they're trying to make sense of that number within the context of what's being taught. So it is engaging their brains, and it doesn't matter that that number was random or not. And she never gives out why. She never gives out the correct answer. And she says, "Oh, that's good. Oh, I see your thinking there." And it sounds very sly, and maybe some people will say, "Hey, that's deceptive." But no, if you think about it, it's not. It's just a very clever tool. Now, what else did I have here? Also, you can discuss the importance of prediction in learning with your students. Yes, again, metacognitive, getting students to think about thinking, okay? This can further help activate neural reward systems. Dopamine comes in. The power of prediction really, really gets the dopamine fired up. It's like playing, video games. So it naturally enhances engagement and strengthens, again, the metacognition in our students. Okay? Okay, now I have one more that I'd like to share with you. This is the final practical tip regarding this power of prediction. Also, please consider the Socratic method, like Socrates, right, the Greek philosopher. Regular teaching, okay, standard teaching, the teacher has a teaching content and the student listens to it. We call this, okay, so-called standard method. Teacher teaches, student learns, that's it, okay? This is quite boring. This is a lecture, okay? This is very passive, okay? We all know passive lectures, we tend to fall asleep, okay? Now, Socratic method, though, instead of giving the answer directly, the teacher asks questions, and then the students ask questions back, and it goes around and around, and it's similar to the graphic organizer situation where the students and the teachers are working together to reach a higher level of enlightenment. Okay, we're getting very philosophical here. This is the Socratic method. So, simply put, instead of blurting out the answer, form it as a question and try to engage the students in a question format instead. Okay, that's also the power of prediction, and you get in on it as well. Okay, because you might not have all the answers, and so, but some of your students might have more details about a certain movie or something, right? So yeah, let the conversation go around and around Socratically instead of one way passive. Okay, that's a very practical application that's directly related to what we were talking about, how the brain works. Now, the last bit here, this is my final practical application. Choice and autonomy. Now, consider the RAS filter. Remember, the RAS only lets in maybe 80 to maybe 95%, 80 to 95% of the information is filtered out. Okay, so I have a baby here. Now, this represents any student. Now, in this case, the baby went for this helicopter instead of the car. We provided choice. So the baby is allowed to play with the helicopter, the baby is allowed to play with the car. It could be university students, it could be this subject, it could be this topic, okay? Now, these choices allow for naturally strong student engagement. Choices and autonomy within the learning context and with the learning content automatically self-caters to students' interests and needs, okay? Now, this can make a huge difference for students. Why? Well, us teachers, we're not gods. We don't automatically have this information. We don't automatically know what the students' needs are. Moreover, can we even answer why this child went for the helicopter? I'm asking this because, okay, the child went for the helicopter, and we might say, oh, the child likes helicopters, or we might go on and on about maybe he or she likes flying things instead of these things with wheels, but it could very much be this child prefers yellow over red. Okay, so it might not have nothing to do with this, but entirely up to the color that is displayed. Okay, so that's a very simplistic example, but I guess you understand what I'm getting at. We do not understand specific student needs. We don't understand specific students' passions. Okay, and even if we see them display their passions, we might get it wrong, as in this case. Does the baby go to the helicopter because it's yellow or because it's a helicopter? We still don't know. Okay, we have to ask them, and that's what's goes back to the idea of making learning visible. Okay, we would try to ask them and work out why they went for that instead. Okay, so that is my final practical application. So, do we have any questions or any ideas you'd like to bring up here?
Yes, there are a couple of questions in the chat,
Great.
and they are related because they are related to how the application of this theory varies based on subject and culture. You previously gave the example of baseball. In
Mm-hmm.
some countries, baseball is so foreign to language learners that it's just they don't even know the rules. So
Yeah.
how does this cultural difference factor in terms of this theory?
Okay, so that is a great question. And let me go. I keep returning to this graph, but, or let's go to the more simple one here. Okay. Hi, Kurt. Okay, so Kurt Fisher and his contemporaries studied dynamic skill theory primarily initially with English-speaking people. And then his later PhD students, one of them was, his name is Kennedy. He did this in Korea. And then this was also done in China by Chang, I think her name was. So it's this mapping out how students will be able to respond, okay, and how we're able to raise them higher by creating a high support context, had never been tested in Japan. And so obviously it was a a great opportunity. So Kurt and I both realized that, yeah, since I'm working in Japan, I should also test to see first of all if this is true for Japanese students in their L1. So I did these interview questions, this self-in relationship, they're called SIR interviews. I was trained in how to do these interviews, and then I did these SIR interviews in Japanese with the Japanese students. And my results, this was for my MA, back when I was working on the MA. So mapped on perfectly. It was only a pilot study because it was an MA. It wasn't a huge study. But it mapped on perfectly. I had 16-year-olds, I had 20, so I had university students, junior high school students, and high school students. Onto this, everybody first started on the blue, and then once we got the graphic organizers out and the brains fired up, everybody was responding on the red. It was like magical. It was almost like too good to be true. It was a small sample size, I will admit. However, every student every student showed the same sort of jump up once they were provided this opportunity, this high support context. So, but it was in Japanese. So the answer to the question is apparently this will work in any culture, in any language, if the interviewer or the teacher who's trying to use this in the classroom knows how to use it in that culture effectively. So I demonstrated that it was possible in Japanese in Japan. I'm half Japanese, as I noted earlier, and then I conducted it entirely in Japanese. Later on, of course, for my PhD, this all switched over to English. But yeah, so I did it in both languages. So I hope that answers the question. It seems that It doesn't matter what culture, what language you're using. If you know what you're doing, you can get students that are on the blue line up to the red line. Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a great
There
question.
is one more question in the chat. Yeah. Could we work the other way around to get to the optimal levels? For example, give students the target and ask them to tell us what they need to get there. So in a way, they think about
Hmm.
the activities needed to achieve the target.
Okay, so
And before you answer, just a quick housekeeping note. People
okay.
in the Zoom room, if you would like to ask a question using the mic, please raise your hand to ask your question. Yes, Robert.
Mm. Okay, so can we turn it around? Yes, I would love to be able to do that. However, uh, whenever we study this, I keep repeating myself, but we start off on the blue line, so the responses, the initial responses that we'd be getting for the students, even though in the classical term the students are highly motivated, they would only be giving us responses that are functional. They're not giving us the best possible, you know, uh, set of responses. We'd have to work at it and work at it, and then again do the graphic organizers and try to edit it and see how we can do this better and this and that. So while we're going back and forth, it ends up being the same thing, doesn't it? We have to go through the steps to get there anyway. So quick answer would be no, because that's just human nature. The brain does not like to. Well, I have two reasons. The brain does not like to overextend itself. The brain does not like to waste energy. It tries to give just enough to get by. Okay? However, when the context changes, and everybody in the room is engaged, then slowly, it progresses and it goes higher up. That's part one. Part two is it would be extremely socially awkward for people to suddenly start talking about something at this depth with somebody on the street, or if somebody you're in the elevator and somebody said, oh well, did you watch the game last night, and then they go off rattling like they're writing a thesis on the subject, right? It's extremely socially awkward, and of course it's so time consuming that it just doesn't happen. We're not used to responding quickly, turning ourselves on to be able to respond at this level. Typically, it's more like this, very simplistic conversations we have with people. At best, at a normal gathering, maybe we'd get this far. Okay, but and what that means is then, yeah, typically we're on the blue. We have to have a very, very, very strong, compelling reason to go any higher to the red. So it takes effort to create that context. Okay, have I answered that question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Again, if anybody wants to ask a question, they can raise their hand in the Zoom room and I will give them the mic. Until we have a question, let me ask you another question.
Sure.
One of the most popular teaching strategies is the PPP.
Aha.
Present, practice, produce. And from this perspective, this methodology seems incomplete, right?
It is. Yeah.
There is a fourth P, stands
Hmm.
for personalization. Could you please tell us more about it?
Wait, did you read my paper?
Of course.
Okay. Yeah, I wrote a paper on this. That's right. So the fourth P is personalization. And that is how we suddenly turn PPP on its head. Um, let's backtrack a little bit. So a lot of the PPP type textbooks are impersonal, right? I mean, they're talking about Jack and Betty, having a dialogue at some city that the student has never been to, and the student really doesn't care about the characters probably, and when they turn the page, it's somebody else again, and there's another grammar point. Um, it it's often hard for the student to get really emotionally invested in that. Um, Maybe they get invested because they really want to pass the course, they want to get a high score or something like that, unrelated to the specific language being taught. The ulterior motive is just to get a high score or to get into a better school later on. They're trying to pass an entrance exam or something. But that PPP textbook is, yeah, it's just a way to get a grade. It's not really there for them to gain competency in or acquire, language at a higher competency. Although the writer may have expected it to be doing that. And dynamic skill theory here, now that shows us that, so PPP pretty much keeps us on this blue line. There's no reason to go any higher. Now, to keep it short, if suddenly now that grammar point or that there's a passage or something, right, that you have to read, you ask the student, well, okay, erase all the nouns, okay, and then put in nouns, things that are in your room, or change them all to the names of the people to your friends or something like that. And suddenly it's wacky, it's funny, but it's very personalized. And that paragraph suddenly comes alive. The students are like reading their paragraphs to each other, like, look at this. I put the frog in the coffee cup or something silly. That wouldn't normally happen in the textbook, right? And suddenly it just comes alive. Now, that level of personalization can happen if you allow, for adjustments in what was happening, what has been written down in the textbook. So that one example is to erase erase all the nouns or erase all the verbs or something like that, and see what the results will be. And when you do that, we have a chance of from going from this blue line up to that red line. Okay, so that's the gist of what we were getting at in that paper, making the the PPP textbook suddenly come alive through personalization, something that the students feel attachment and ownership of. If things in their room or their friends are now written in the textbook, suddenly there's a big ownership there, right? And so, yeah, there are in the hopes of helping teachers who are stuck with PPP textbooks. So we wrote that paper, maybe more than 10 years ago, but yeah. Okay, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. We talked about this topic, if you remember, at a Starbucks in Nottingham 10 years ago, maybe immediately after. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, now okay, yeah.
So
Remember that
there is
Starbucks.
another question. Yeah, there
Yeah.
is another question, an interesting question. So previously we talked about intrinsic motivation and how this construct is reinterpreted in the context of dynamic skill theory. How about critical thinking? So it seems that a lot of people can only go up a level if they improve their critical thinking skills, right? Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, well, a lot of this hinges on how we define critical thinking. Yeah, what is critical thinking? Um, and how we assess critical thinking. So, you know, so let me go to this one where the students started off, okay, they told us what we did. At that point, the students thought they were giving me the best possible answer, probably, right? They had nothing in their mind thinking that I'm goofing off. I'm being lazy. So are we allowed to say they were thinking critically, even if they're on the blue line? I think we can. I think we can say that. I mean, knowing what we know now, a 20-year-old can do a response 2 levels higher if, their brains are fired up. But if we didn't know that and we got that response, then we might think, well, okay, this student gave this response and they were thinking critically, but that was all they were able to produce. But we know better. We know better. With dynamic skill theory, we know that they're likely be able to produce a much better response if they're given the chance. They have the potential to go up higher. So yeah, and then of course this is if we analyze this response and the blue line response and the red line response. Obviously, because the red line response is 2 levels higher, it's much more critical, it's much more detailed, it's much more complex. But again, it comes down to how do we define critical thinking and how do we assess critical thinking? I would like to say that on the blue line, they did nothing wrong. It's just natural for them to be responding at that level. And in fact, they could have done worse. They could have blown me off, basically. They could have done responded with an even more simplistic response. So, am I caught in a loop here? So, both are, I think, so this is critical thinking level A and critical thinking level B. Let's put it that way then. How's that sound?
Yeah. Okay. So the more critical thinking skills they have, the higher they go then in this hierarchy.
Well, if that's true, if you assess critical thinking in that way, I mean, if it's a yes no question, were they thinking critically, then both I would say yes to, right? So yeah, that's why I say it hinges on how we define what critical thinking is and how we assess the level of critical thinking. I mean, if it's a yes no question, then it would be yes for both, I would say. So that's a really good question, but yeah, we'd have to work on how we define what critical thinking is in this context.
Okay, and this is a great question for the next PhD thesis then. Another question that seems to be yes, we have somebody. Peggy, would you like to join?
Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to ask if, for example, we're working with students, instead of if we tell them what the target is, for example, the target is to learn how to describe a house, and we ask them, what do you think you would need? Like, and they would go like, we need to know what is bedroom, how do we say bedroom, or all the other stuff, and the furniture, colors, and blah, blah, blah. And then we give them the activities they work on. Do you think that this would be more interesting, and then maybe they would have made an executive decision, we need to know this and that, and the information could go past the RAS, you said?
Yes, yes, exactly. You've got a firm grasp on this concept. Yeah, exactly. So, task-based learning has trouble in the way it's defined and all, but the core of what they're trying to get at with task-based or inquiry-based instruction, these types of teaching methods are like this. You give the students a task, something they have to complete. They have to figure out how to do it. They come to you with the questions, and then you provide the answers. It's not like you're lecturing. So that's exactly the better way to get around. It's getting their executive function working. and definitely they're not on the blue line. You know, they're above the blue line, and hopefully almost touching the red line by the end of that task. So yeah, very
Thank
good
you.
understanding of today's content.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have another question. We have talked about school students, we have talked about college students. Now there is a question asking about if you have any thoughts about applying this theory to senior learners who are 65 years of age and older.
Sure, sure. Okay. The big difference is the red squiggly lines are gone. Okay, that's a big difference. But you notice here it says gap increases with age to a certain point, and then they kind of both taper off. But there is always the blue line is always going to be below the red line. It doesn't make sense that the red line ever goes below the blue line, right? Obviously. At some point, there may be a huge cognitive decline where the red line and the blue line start touching each other, and there's nothing that an outside person can do to raise that. But that's a really extreme example. There, for the purpose of this discussion, there was always going to be a gap between the blue and red, right? So as we get older, and I also teach adult students, and I do the same thing. I teach them about dynamic skill theory. In fact, I spend the most time with the adults in dynamic skill theory. And they seem to be more interested in this than the university students are. There are many reasons for that. Many of the university students, as we know, they're there to, to graduate. They'll get the stamp punched. But adults, when they come to the classroom, they have curiosity. They have questions. They want to be satisfied. And so, they really get into this dynamic skill theory. And so, again, we use graphic organizers, and then I bluntly ask them, so your performance today, do you think it was on the blue line? Do you think it was on the red line? And yeah, it all works out the same way. And after a while, to be honest, I don't have to ask them anymore because they get a really good understanding of what engagement looks like in the classroom, real red line engagement. And so the classroom full of adults, once they get this, and there's a culture of this in the classroom, it's much easier for me to create this high support context. It requires much less effort than with, say, a university student classroom or a high school student's classroom. So with older people, does it work? Yes, definitely. In fact, it probably works better because they have a more intense attitude towards this learning what this dynamic skill theory is about, and they take it to heart. And they help create that classroom atmosphere. They help create that culture of bringing everybody up to the red line. Far better than the typical university student classroom is like. Okay. Great question.
So, any other questions from the audience? Let's see if there are any questions. Seems that there aren't any more questions.
We had
Robert,
great questions.
thank you. It has been a very fascinating talk and lots of interesting information and promising area of research for people who want to do research and looking at the brain and neuroscience and how to integrate it with the mind and psychology and education and cutting edge research. Thank you for your time. Any final thoughts?
Thank you very much. No, this is a difficult topic. Dynamic skill theory is not really something that I'm supposed to be talking about in like 30 minutes or an hour or something. I should be spending a lot more time on it. But from the questions that I've received, I can tell, and responses, people listening have gotten a really good understanding of this. And if you have other questions, I have my email address right there. Or you can send to Ali, of course, and then maybe he'll forward them. Oh, yeah, of course, he will forward them to me. But yeah, you can. This is my university address, so you can find me there. I have lots of papers on ResearchGate, so you can look me up on ResearchGate as well. Mostly, I'm writing about this area of of teaching. So yeah, if you're interested, please look that up as well. Thank you.
So thank you everybody for coming. This has been an interesting and enjoyable session. People are saying so in the comments. Thank you everybody and see you again next time. So Robert, I have stopped the